Hello and welcome to this new tutorial. In this tutorial, we shall talk about the concept of absolute war in international relations. Well, the concept of absolute war was introduced by Karl Clausewitz in On War, that is his famous book, which is a theoretical model of a war in its most extreme and unrestrained form. It describes a scenario where a war is waged without political, moral, or resource constraint, aiming for the complete annihilation of the enemy. Though rarely realized in practice, the idea of absolute war serves as a benchmark for understanding the dynamics of conflict in international relations. So when we talk about the concept of absolute war in international relation, this idea was initially introduced by a great strategist, Clausewitz, in his famous book on war. And in that book, he basically talks about a theoretical model of a war, which is the most extreme and unrestrained form of a war, because he talks about a scenario where a war is waged on a particular country or against your enemy without having any political, moral, or without facing any issues of a resource constraint. And in that war, the entire aim of that war is to completely annihilate your enemy. And when we take this as a scenario today in international relation, a very dynamic and contemporary international relations, then we will realize that in reality or in practice, the idea of absolute war serves as a benchmark for understanding the dynamics of today's conflict. And therefore, the concept of absolute war in international relations has important space in the studies of international relations and war and peace as an overall scenario. Now, Clausewitz emphasized that the war is an extension of a politics, by other means connecting it inherently to a state interest and power struggle, which is a central theme in the realist school of international relations. While absolute war represents a hypothetical extreme, historical examples like World War II illustrates war approaching this level of intensity. In World War II, total mobilization, civilian targets, example Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and ideological imperatives pushed conflict closer to Clausewitz's concept. So Clausewitz basically emphasized that war is an extension of a politics, by other means, which is widely been accepted in the international relations, that state often goes to the war as a last resort because diplomacy is failed, you don't have any other option to achieve the national objectives or whatever the power struggle is all about, and therefore we see that state often use war as an extension of its politics by other means, and therefore it is very much connected inherently to the state interest. In fact, it has also been very much connected to the power struggle which state is part of today in international relation. And in fact, today the central theme in the realist school of IR is all about how state protects its interest, how states gets into the power struggle, and eventually how state will use war as a tool or war as part of its extension of a politics to achieve those interests. So we have seen in the World War II scenario where we almost saw an absolute war, hypothetically, although in the historical context that in the World War II, as we have seen, the level of intensity, the level of mobilization of resources, the level of targeting the civilians, particularly in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the ideological imperative which actually pushed the conflict more closer to the way how Clausewitz talks about in his concept of absolute war. So the classic example where we almost reached to the Clausewitz concept of total war or absolute war was during the World War II. Well, in modern IR, the potential for a nuclear war serves as a stark reminder of the danger of absolute war. In fact, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which is famously been known as MAD, MAD, during the Cold War demonstrated how the concept of absolute war could shape strategic thinking. While superpowers avoided direct conflict, the threats of escalation to an absolute war influenced diplomacy and conflict resolution. So yes, in the modern international relations, the potential for any nuclear war is probably that space where Clausewitz's concept of absolute war actually comes into reality, because in the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which was being practiced during the Cold War in a big way, because it demonstrated that if war takes place between the two nuclear power, then obviously both the nuclear powers knows it very well that it is nothing but mutually assured destruction. One nuclear attack will lead to multiple nuclear strikes coming from countries who are at the war with their nuclear weapons. So therefore, superpowers, after knowing the fact of the impact of MAD, avoided direct conflict, and the threat escalation to absolute war eventually led to influence diplomacy and conflict resolution. So that gave away a space for a diplomacy, that if there are conflict emerging between the two nuclear power, diplomacy is the only way to reduce that tension and to avoid getting to that absolute war scenario, and thus you have mechanism developed to resolve those conflict in the international relations. Additionally, the concepts highlights the distinction between total war, example World War I and II, and limited war, example the Gulf War or conflict in Balkans, where political objectives and resources constrained prevent escalation. So apart from the total war or absolute war, we also have a concept like a limited war. And today in the international scenario, we have various examples where, knowing the fact that if the two great powers clash together and eventually if they bring in their nuclear weapons, then obviously it is all about understanding and accepting that we are reaching to a point of mutually assured destruction. So therefore, to avoid mutually assured destruction, the limited war scenario also has emerged, and we have various classic examples right from the Cold War period, post-Cold War period, in more contemporary scenario, where because of political objectives and resource constraint has prevented the escalation to an absolute war or a total war. Well, therefore, in contemporary international relations, we have various norms such as international humanitarian laws and institutions like the United Nations, which aim to prevent conflict from escalating into absolute war. For instance, the establishment of nuclear non-proliferation treaties seeks to curb the possibilities of unrestrained warfare, underscoring the enduring relevance of Clausewitz's theoretical framework in global politics. So therefore, in contemporary international relations, we have various norms and institutions like international humanitarian laws, like United Nations, who are trying their best to prevent a conflict escalating into an absolute war. And therefore, we have established certain treaties like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and through this nuclear non-proliferation treaty we are basically trying to curb down the possibilities of any unrestrained, uncontrolled warfare, particularly the nuclear warfare, because it is very much visible and very much understandable that Clausewitz theoretical framework in global politics still has a relevance, because if a nation goes for absolute war, particularly a nations with nuclear weapons, then obviously that would be the end of this world, and that is where the doctrine of mutually assured destructions becomes the reality. So this is all about the concept of absolute war in international relations. I hope you have understood this concept, and I will see you soon in the next tutorial. Till then, take care.